Welcome to HappyCrappy Paints, Chests and Barrels for Conan. We begin with applying a black base paint, and we're starting off with the square barrels. As you can see here, there's a lot of attention to details on these chests, except for the lid. I don't know if something went wrong in the mold on all of the barrels or just a poor mold. For this we're using Tailored Sand, Mournfang Brown, Lead Belcher and Shade, Agrex Earth Shade and some Nuln Oil. My goal with this series is I named it HappyCrappy just because I wanted to show how I decided to paint the Conan figures. Since there's many of them, I wanted to actually play the game at some point. So the idea is to paint them quickly, taking a lot of shortcuts, but making them look good enough for the tabletop, using as few colors as possible. So for this it's 2 shades of brown and silver, Lead Belcher and Shade. That's pretty much it. For the first coat of brown, I mixed Tailored Sand and Mournfang to get it to the shade that I wanted, applying the first layer liberally. I watered the color quite a bit to make sure that I don't fill in the details of the mold too much. If I would have spent more time, I would have watered the color more to allow for more details on the mold to remain when I'm done. But in the interest of speed, I didn't want to spend a lot of time painting a lot of layers. So 2 layers is what I ended up applying, allowing in some instances for the black to come through. So when you add the shading, it nicely gives the chests a weathered look. When you apply the second layer, you can use the planks and don't fill in the gaps in between to make sure that the shade contours the chest nicely. So the shade actually fills in the gaps and creates contours for the planks. The lid, since they didn't have a lot of mold lines, I painted the second layer for the planks and let the first layer shine through to give the illusion of planks without having any mold lines. It turned out okay. Could have probably spent more time accentuating the planks using a lighter color of brown at the edges of those planks. But in the interest of time, and they look good anyway, I didn't do that. Adding the Lead Belcher. You don't have to be too careful making mistakes here. You can always go back and correct them with brown. It's easier to correct mistakes you do with silver, with brown, rather than spending a lot of time making sure you don't make mistakes in the first place. They're easy enough to fix with painting them over with brown. You can see here that I make a few mistakes sometimes that I then corrected. Applying the first layer of shading, I think for one of the chests I added a second layer. I ended up not doing that for all the chests. I didn't think it was needed. But apply shading liberally. Don't try not to get any of the Agrex Earth Shade onto the silver, because it'll turn a little slightly brown. We can use Nuln Oil for that later. But do make sure that you get a shading all the way up to the silver, because that adds to the contour lines and also adds the illusion of a shadow. It doesn't really matter if it pools a little bit on the top. It adds just character to the chest. You can see there that I'm adding a little more shade around the bands to make the bands stand out. So same thing with the null oil, apply it liberally and also go a little beyond the silver, especially underneath, to add the illusion of a light source from above the chest. It turned out really nicely, and they were quite quick to do as well. Moving over to the more ornate chests, using a similar technique, apply the first layer liberally. I decided to mix this brown a little lighter, so more of the tailored sand than the square chests, giving the illusion that the wood is more expensive, or just a lighter shade of wood for these more ornate chests. You don't have to worry to get paint into the ornate pieces at the bottom of the chest. You're going to use Agrex Earth Shade for that. Here you can see that I try to take care to not get a lot of paint in the gaps between the planks. As I said before, those contours, I want them to be accentuated by the Earth Shade. So I want to make sure that there is a gap there for the Earth Shade to fill in. The reason I paint the metal bands brown is to make sure that I do get brown all the way up to the actual bands. So it's if I make a mistake with the silver, it's not black there, it's going to be brown. Again, it doesn't really matter since we're going to use a lot of shade, and it's going to accentuate the contours anyway. That was the idea I had, at least. I could have watered the brown from these chests a little more and adding a third layer. I did lose some of the details on the lid, but it turned out fine anyway. Here, if you'd like to add some finishing touches to these chests, you could add other shades like bronze to the locking mechanism. I decided not to, in the interest of speed. Again, it doesn't matter if you miss a little with the silver. It's easy enough to correct afterwards. Going back over the chests again with some brown. As you can see, I'm doing all the chests at the same time. So when I'm done with one step, I stop the recording and continue with all the remaining chests before moving on to the next step. I didn't do any final touch-ups of these chests, but what you can do if you'd like is in the end, after you apply the shade, go back and do some dry brushing, light dry brushing on top of the metal bands with lead belcher to bring out some shine to the heads of the bolts. I thought it looked good without that, but it's something that you could do. Painting the sides and the handles, I decided to paint a hinge using lead belcher, but not the actual handle. I hadn't decided at this point whether I wanted to make the handle a different color or not, but decided that I did not want it to be a metal to make the handle stick out more. I decided in the end to just leave it in the same wood color as the rest of the chest, and it looked perfectly fine that way. But you could add maybe a lighter brown for the handles, or maybe even go red or blue. The chests actually look pretty nice without the shading, so you could do that if you'd like, and the shading is optional. Again, apply the shading liberally. It will pool at the bottom of the chest, which makes it look really nice. If you'd want, you could also use a different color for some dry brushing, a lighter brown or light gray at the bottom to make it look like it's been standing in dirt or sand. Again, I do not want to spend a lot of time on these, since there's lots to paint for Conan. Make sure again that you get shading all the way to the metal bands. Adding the null oil. You know the drill by now. Go a little beyond the edges of the metal bands to add the shadow effect and also accentuating the contours for the metal bands. You can go a little wider on the wood and on the underside of the metal band on the side there. As you can see here, I went actually quite a bit on the outside of the bands, and it turned out to look really good in the end. Made the chests look worn. So there you go. That was the end result of the ornate chests. Moving on to the barrels, same technique. I lost the footage somehow for the first layer of brown, but I think you get the idea of how these are painted. So I didn't go back and try to salvage that footage. I just deleted that file. Here you can see I changed a different technique where I almost dried brushed the brown on, and it was I discovered this technique very late. This is the 5th barrel, and it was so much quicker and than the classic style of just painting it on. So I wished I'd figured that out earlier. Adding silver to the metal bands was a pain. Just turning the barrel every so often without dropping the barrel, which I did a couple of times, was a pain, and it felt like it was more than one. I had to turn it more than once to get around the whole way around. It felt like I was turning it all the time. I also spent, this is the first barrel of the 5 that I painted, that I filmed, and I spent a little too much time here painting the edge of the metal band down to the wood. You can see that I'm adding a little too much detail here. I ended up painting half the band one way and then turning the barrel upside down to paint the other half. You don't need to do this. I realized while I was doing this that the shading is going to cover up the edges of the band anyway. You're going to add 2 layers of shading, both the agrax and the null oil, so it's going to cover up the edges of the band towards the wood nicely, so you don't have to spend the time that I spent here. Painting the top band. Soon you're going to see when I turn it upwards and paint the edge towards the lid. I found that the mold lines were a little different between the barrels, and it was sometimes hard to see where the metal ends and the wood begins. But make sure that you do paint a little bit, paint the edge a little bit, so that you can actually see the metal on top. You can see in a little while when I add the null oil that it has a nice contouring effect to the top. I added a lot of Agrax Earth shade to the barrels. I wanted them to be darker than the other chests. They also made them look more used, maybe, perhaps, than the chests. So I let it pool liberally. I did remove some, especially around the cork. As you can see, I used the other paint buckets I wasn't using at the time with some putty on them to hold the barrels while I was painting, so I can switch between the barrels quickly without having to touch the barrel while the shading was drying. Shade take a little longer to dry than normal paint. Here you can see the contour lines for the metal. By applying the Nuln Oil carefully, you get a nice contour at the top. For these, I actually decided to add a little finishing touch with tallard sand for the cork. I decided not to paint all the way towards the wood. I didn't want to risk making a mistake and get tallard sand to the side of the barrel, and it looked perfectly nice without having that shade of brownish yellow all the way down to the side of the wood. Worked perfectly. I also added some markings on the barrels, like merchant marking, to identify the contents of the barrels. For this I used Bishop de Bone, which is a nice white yellow color. It doesn't stand out as much as if I would have used a pure white. So I like this color for these types of details on wood. So there you go, barrels and chests for Conan.